All right. George, Bill, thanks for being with us tonight. I was thinking earlier about how we ought to start this conversation, and I know that we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the ethics of this really transformative technology later. But first, I want to kind of open on a note of wonder by asking you a personal question, which is sort of where were you, and do you remember where you were when you first heard about CRISPR and that this was possible, and what were the sort of your immediate reactions? What sort of imaginings kind of leapt into your mind when you heard that?
Go on, George.
Right. Well, it was slow dawning, actually, in part because we had been working on genome editing since I started my lab in 1986. So to me, CRISPR was just another way to edit. I know that's unfair. And I knew about it as a phenomenology where it was just, I also do computational biology, and it was just a repeat. It was the so-called junk DNA of the genome. And you know, I had more respect for junk DNA than the average person, but nevertheless, it was junk because it was repetitive, it was not conserved, and we didn't know what it did. So that was sort of in the more than a decade ago. But then we didn't really jump onto it as a technology until 2012.
And do you remember when you first sort of glimpsed its potential?
I mean, it was I'm sorry I'm giving such a vague, it was kind of a gradient. Still am not sure I see much potential in it.
That's interesting. Bill, how about you?
My background is very similar to George's. I was trained in medical school by Paul Berg and a variety of people who were involved in early efforts to do gene editing. And so it was on my radar very early. But when CRISPR became clearer and through the literature, it became obvious we had a tool that was easier, more precise, cheaper, and it was the beginning of a spectrum of genomic interventions that would have a potential dramatic effect on science and medicine. I would say, first off, that above all, I think it's a revolution in the lab, and its clinical applications will follow from that, and those we can talk about more specifically. But it's opening up the ease of doing research a great deal.
How about just zooming out from CRISPR as a particular technique, and let's go to gene editing in general. If you were to, and I know you aren't historians of science, but you are some familiarity with kind of the recent history of biotechnology, how do you situate gene editing as, like, how transformative is it relative to DNA sequencing, for instance, or previous innovations along those lines?
Well, I've been involved in both of those, I suppose. We brought down the price of sequencing from $3 billion to less than 1,000, and it's more or less at $0 to the customer now. So I think that's a very dramatic change, and it's very hard to edit without being able to read. If you ever tried it, you'll know what I mean. So I think that's a bigger revolution personally, and I think that editing, you can do editing essentially by synthesis in some cases, or it's hard to do editing without synthesis, so that's another revolution. Both those revolutions tend to get eclipsed by CRISPR, and I'm not even sure it's that much cheaper. I mean, if you go out and you buy CRISPR on the market, it's about $500. If you buy almost all the previous editing methods, it's about $500. So. Nevertheless, it is a revolution. There is a revolution going on. There's no doubt about that. I want to be very clear, and it involves reading, writing, and editing. And that whole cluster of things is exponential, and it's alarmingly fast, faster than the computer revolution by a long shot.
Well, I certainly agree with all that. This is a synergistic process with lots of factors adding in, including artificial intelligence and computer power of analyzing what we get. I think it's CRISPR. George says, well, there's other things, and yes, I think it maybe will be historically looked at as a kind of a hinge moment, though, when things went into sort of hyperspeed and science and medicine in the discoveries in biology advanced at a much more rapid rate. And CRISPR basically gives us the tools of inquiry, as I said, and interventions, such that finally the promise of genomic intervention, and it's more than editing, by the way, this has been implied. CRISPR allows operations at many levels of genomic operation, including on the RNA as well as the DNA, and this gives you can change genes, but you can also turn genes on and off in their expression, and so this is a very versatile tool, and it's going to advance our understanding of a great deal of natural development. One thing we all need to understand and take account of is that 20th century, we did a lot of studies of molecular biology and understood the basic ingredients of human life. In the 21st century, we're entering the era of developmental biology, and we're going to understand how organisms are knit together, both in health and in sickness. And that's going to give us amazing new tools. I have heard, I'm not an authority on this, and George can confirm this or correct me, I've heard that our current armamentarium of pharmacologic interventions target about 250 protein sites. And by any reasonable calculation, there would be probably, tens of thousands of potential sites to operate on? So as we gain knowledge, we're going to look back on this era as just the tiny beginnings of our interventions into life, and especially human life. If I got that right, George?
That's roughly right, yeah.
All right.
He knows a lot more of the science than I do.
Yeah. George, you're a resident fact checker today,
Yeah.
so we appreciate it. Let's talk about gene editing a little more specifically. We've been talking kind of generally about its potential right now. I want to move to sort of give us the landscape of specific applications that are ongoing, that are in the lab, and that, or that even have appeared in scientific papers, or that you all know from the rumor mill are imminently going to appear in scientific papers. And then give us some of the sort of far out thinking for the next 10, 20 years as to what these techniques might be able to accomplish.
I'm going to broaden it just a tiny bit so we don't have to say CRISPR necessarily, but you can change developmental, you can advance the developmental biology to the point where you can transplant organs, and we've done that mainly in pigs, where you have to make multiple edits, about 80 different edits to the genome, in order to get them close enough that they're good organ donors. And so that's moved into preclinical transplants now at MGH here in Boston. Another one is aging reversal. That's something where we have a list of about 300 genes that are known to be involved in either longevity or aging reversal in mice and other organisms. And you can extend the life of the mouse by a factor of 2. You can reverse all the markers of aging that we know of in a few days, from very old to embryonic and anything in between. And so we've converted those into gene therapies, which there are now quite a few gene therapies that are in clinical trials, and these are in clinical trials now in dogs, because people care about their dogs. And then a few years from now, we will be doing them in humans. So those are two examples, transplants and aging reversal, because many of us will die, most of us in industrialized nations will die of diseases that do not kill 20-year-olds, about 90% of us. So it's an important category.
As someone who's currently at their physiological peak, does that mean I could press pause?
Or reverse, or pause, or reverse.
Or reverse.
Or reverse. I realize you wouldn't want to go back below before your peak, but
Yeah, no.
you could hypothetically do it. Yeah.
Maybe I'd want to experience the climb again.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yes. Yeah. It's
On
the
a
journey.
serious note,
It's the
yeah,
journey.
It's
Yeah,
the
that's
journey.
right.
Bill, talk to me a little bit about the thoughts that pop into your mind when you think about, as someone who is in touch with sort of the cultural, the philosophical, the theological implications of these technologies. When you think about human lifespans that are radically longer, or certain stages of life which previously have been sort of short seasons or 10 or 15-year runs, being extended by decades, for instance, what sort of changes and sort of cultural transformations are we in for if we have a world like that?
Well, being from Silicon Valley, I'm getting used to all this. But here's the thing. The question that you just asked George, what's this going to affect? I would say it's probably going to affect ultimately every biological parameter of human existence. And I think it's going to play out in sort of like the App Store on the iPhone, that it starts out with the idea that there'll be a few little useful things, maps and a few things. And then in a period of years, maybe decades, but it's in the scheme of things, that's not long, we're probably going to have hundreds and maybe thousands of applications of biological interventions that we can't anticipate today. There's a strange process by which things become clearer that you didn't even know were there. I mean, it's the way it works. And so, for example, somebody today emailed me about the possibility of turning on the genes that are related to the effects that Botox produces in its application in cosmetic surgery. And then they had some other ideas for doing basic skin interventions that would be cosmetic in effect. And these were ideas that I hadn't thought of very deeply. I mean, obviously there are many ways to go in and do things. But when it comes to issues like reversing aging or even forestalling or precluding aging, that's a very heavy-laden concept. I mean, we need to ask ourselves larger questions about what the meaning of such interventions would actually be. At the founding of the Society for Regenerative Medicine, William Haseltine said just bluntly and overtly, the real goal is to keep people alive forever. And I debated this guy named Aubrey de Grey. Do you know Aubrey de Grey?
Very well.
I debated him in the Civic Center in San Francisco in a forum put on by the Chronicle last year. And Aubrey de Grey says that if he can just live 35 more years, he's confident that he will live to be 1,000, because in those intervening years, the advances will unfold so rapidly that he will achieve what he calls, the society will achieve what he calls longevity escape velocity, so that the advances will come faster than the aging process. I doubt that he's right on that, by the way. Maybe this is my skepticism as a physician, but I have a certain sense that these will turn out to be much more complicated processes to intervene in than are imagined. Although we can hear from George about what's happening with animal models, and that'll give us some hint, but maybe just some hint, because animals may be different with regard to aging than humans at some levels. But yes, at the deepest level, we want to ask ourselves the fundamental questions. What is the source and significance of the natural world? How do we relate to the integrated and deeply interdependent processes of the natural unfolding of the world and our lives embedded in it? And in what ways does that circumstance, our natural circumstance, provide the foundational frame for our optimal physical, psychological, and spiritual meaning as human beings?
We've talked a little bit this week about human flourishing as a goal, really, of a human life. And just to add some specificity to this conversation, again, imagine, let's not get too radical, let's just say 200-year lifespans were a thing, that biotechnology of some kind could help us achieve. Could you imagine, now you could imagine that that might lead in the short term to inequalities of various sorts. I often think about how it might make the loss of a young person just unbelievably tragic in a way that maybe we don't experience yet. But also might it open up new avenues for human flourishing, new, what does a 170-year marriage look like? What sorts of artworks can someone, create across, 100 years? What sorts of science could someone like George do, if he had another George will be with us a long time, but if he were to live to the year 2100, do you see positives in that kind of world?
I see a lot of positives.
Yeah.
I also worry about it. You need to worry about things like overpopulation and so forth. But yeah, I think, sometimes you worry that we won't be creative as older people. I know a lot of older people that are a lot more creative than some 20-year-olds. Part of it has to do with how comfortable you are with your history and your future and things like that. And also, if you're reversing aging, you should be reversing all the processes that might ossify or de-ossify you. So I think there's great opportunity for both pessimism and optimism, and it's up to us to nudge it in the right direction.
And the pessimism for you on this particular question of aging is mostly like matter of Malthusian concerns.
Right. We need to be cautious about that. But even about power structure and money and things like that. But I think the power and money are probably a little easier to solve. If you put our mind to it, we can make technologies. We brought down the price of sequencing.
Sure.
10 million fold. We can probably do that with aging. We're starting with dogs just to kind of demonstrate that can be very inexpensive. But in terms of Malthusian, I think we need to get off the planet for a whole variety of reasons. Some of us back up the Earth, and maybe that would be a partial solution if we can bring down the price of that.
So George, there's often a distinction made between lifespan and health span, and some of these interventions may keep us healthier until we kind of get to the edge of the cliff and then drop off.
Yeah.
That's the way, by the way, it was figured out in Brave New World, where they're very healthy until the last 30 days, and then Huxley had them go off the edge.
That actually happens in supercentenarians. People make it past 110,
Right.
tend to die quickly.
So that would be improvement in health span.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any evidence from your studies with something other than mice, which are designed probably by nature to die young because they otherwise they get eaten by predators, can't reproduce? But do you have evidence that large, long, otherwise fairly long-living creatures can have their lifespan extended?
Well, certainly the average human lifespan is twice what it used to be. So that's one piece of evidence. The other one is, if you look among mammals, you can find pairs of mammals that have tenfold differences in lifespan that are otherwise closely related. So, for example, the bowhead whale is the longest-lived mammal. It's 200 years already. So 200 years is reasonable in the mammalian lineage in that regard. The naked mole rat will live 10 times as long as the rat. So you could say, the naked mole rat lived better or something like that, but they have pretty horrible life. They have such high CO2 concentrations because they all huddle together that they've changed their pain sensors because they have so much acid in their skin.
So they wouldn't be in favor of extended longevity, huh?
They have voted with their genes. They live a long time relative to rats. So I don't know. I don't think there's no physics that says we can't live a long time. And I think I tend to agree somewhat with Aubrey on this point, not all points, that our technology today is so much more amazing than it was when I started graduate school, and 30 years from now it'll be hard to even for us most visionary people to imagine what it's going to be like because it's such a steep exponential.
So as a general rule, just so that you got a perspective on this, the kinds of things you read about, what they do with roundworms and mice and so forth, the advances in age of even things like caloric restriction, which you probably all heard about, tend to go down as you get to larger, more complex beings. It's less in dogs than in mice, and less in monkeys, and probably less in humans. And it may very well be that humans are already optimized at some level for kind of a balance of their purposes, including aging purposes. Now that doesn't mean we couldn't extend life somewhat and employ tools that nature simply can't deliver in the coordinated coherence of normal development. But it does raise questions about what's good for us, as you mentioned. When I was on the President's Council on Bioethics, we did a book called Beyond Therapy, Biotechnology and the Pursuit of Happiness, and it was a very fascinating study. And one of the chapters in that book is on ageless bodies. And while we were doing this, I did a little calculation that if you figure a generation span is about 25 years, now it seems to be a little older, but let's say 25 years, and say everybody, because of all this advance, lived to be 150 years old, then the newborn baby would have 64 great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-great-great-grandparents, and so forth. They would be so separated by genetics, they wouldn't really be that related because you divide your genetics in half every time there's a generation. And second, they'd be unrelated at some level on culture. I find it hard enough to keep up with my Stanford students. And so, they probably couldn't remember each other's names. So it would certainly change the meaning of family at some level. And there are many social issues. I mean, I think we don't need to be rigid about that. We can handle those social issues perhaps. But there might be personal issues that were very different. For example, it's possible that given that kind of longevity, we'd be more afraid of dying than we were in past centuries. I once talked with a woman who was 104 years old. She was really great. She was ambulatory. She was cognitively with it. And she said to me, well, the happiest years of my life have been since I turned 80, because after that I stopped worrying about dying young. But then she got a little wistful and she said, and it was poignant to hear it, she said, but my husband died 56 years ago. All of my children have died, and some of my grandchildren have died. So what does it do to life? Does it change the character of life? And at the foundation of these matters, we need to keep in mind our deepest questions about what we think our lives are for, if you will. And I'm not saying that we have to be rigid about that. We maybe don't know completely what our lives are for, but I know some of what I think my life is for, and it doesn't all comport with every possible scenario of biological intervention, even if it serves my physical being. I want my life to have a meaning that is consistent with my values, that serves others around me, that is a sort of divine pedagogy where I learn to understand the nature of the source and being of my existence.
And are there particular, I mean, you were just enumerating a few sort of possible ways that extended lifespans could come into tension with those values, but are there more, it still sounded to me like you were open to the idea that on balance, it might actually allow for greater forms of human flourishing. Are there, putting aside that, let's grant the premise that we don't know yet whether this is possible in humans, or maybe George knows, but the rest of us don't know. And just say, in an imaginary world, could you find it conceivable, or do you think, have you done some calculation in your head where you say, actually, I've looked at the trade-offs and the bads outweigh the good here, and we should sort of stick to the normal human lifespan?
George, how about you? Have you had those thoughts in this process?
Oh, I worry about everything. I worry about that.
This will give you more time for worrying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So this is if you're worried about your grandchildren dying, you could have new children, right? You could have a whole new generation of
Replace them.
well, not replace them, just have a new family. They're irreplaceable, if you have cultural barriers, you can work at it. You've got plenty of time to work at either learning the new culture or creating a new culture. There's no reason why you can't create the next sensation in music, for example, at the age of 180. So, I mean, I think we need to expand our minds just a little bit to think that we're not, the 180-year-olds of the future will not necessarily be as locked into their ways as the 80-year-olds today. Some of them are already quite creative and flexible.
Are there aspects of human culture, to sort of ask a reverse question of you, that you would say, actually, I want to put up some barriers around these aspects of human culture where biotechnology should not intrude?
Well, I think making armies of sociopaths would probably not be in the best interests of society.
But that's ultimately a kind of utilitarian argument that it would create more suffering. Are there things that you regard as just are so interdependent or have such a high value by being part of pure nature, or Bill is really saying that some of these things just ought not to be tinkered with in general. Is there anything like that for you?
Probably a lot. I would say, unfortunately, we're no longer anywhere near pure nature. 97% of the animals, large animals on the planet, are pets and agricultural species, and us. So that's very far from what one we consider natural, and our lifespan is already twice what it was. And we wear clothes and we go in rockets and jets and things. It's a very unnatural world that we're in, and I'm mostly think it's positive. I'm not even sure we necessarily have to improve on our happiness. I think if we just had it more equally distributed, or so that the happiest people that are happy today are pretty much everybody has access to that. And again, that might be an economic thing, because happiness to me is just a part of what you need to accomplish your goals and values of society. One of the biggest one, I think, is that we survive when Earth goes down. And I think and it will, almost certainly.
So jumping back to the issue of longevity and happiness and meaning, it certainly puts one in an awkward position to try to in any way defend death. Abraham Lincoln spoke of aging as the bombardment by the silent artillery of time. It's a poignant phrase. I think most of us would like to live longer, and that would be a fairly natural motion of human intention. The question becomes then how, and at what expense, or at what alteration of the meaning of life. And George mentioned that we've increased the lifespan significantly in the past century, and that's true. At the turn of the century to the 19th to 20th century, the average lifespan was less than 50 years old. Now, in some of the more developed parts of the places like Monaco and other places, the lifespan is approaching 90. And it's very possible that even with no biotechnological interventions, many people can live to be over 100, and certain people might even live to be 120, 130. With no biotechnology, just better operations within the world, understanding what diet and exercise and sleep and lower stress, less social media maybe, and things can do for us. But here's the difference, and that is that these changes in the last century have come about through intelligible operations on the known world. And most of them are not biotechnology in the strict sense. They're mostly diet, sanitation, better understanding of what is healthy. And that comports well with human beings involved in their own lives in a positive and constructive way. I think it's a hard point to make. It's a little abstruse. But I think we have to be very careful that we don't turn our lives into something that is not easily understood by ourselves. In other words, we have to be careful that we don't make the transformations of our nature, physical and biological, as well as mental and psychological, into something that's more akin to magic. And I think for my own life, life has something to do with the given conditions of my life and my operation within the world to try to express the excellence of my capacities to the degree I'm capable of doing so. And it's within that frame that my meaning emerges in part. Now, I don't want to make this too abstract, but if you go to something like sports, we can easily imagine biotechnological interventions in sports that would make you better at something in the sense that you could run faster or jump higher or something, but it might vitiate the whole meaning of sports and the way it plays for the individual life and the social collective of the sports events. And that gives us sort of frame of why human beings are not merely products, they are actual processes. They have purposes that are played out in the way they live their lives. I guess I'm willing to say that I think the purpose of life in the broadest sense is this kind of experientially based ascent toward a deeper and more profound, what you might call magnification of soul, an expansion of self in a way that is consistent with the deepest possibilities in the created order.
And there's something about longevity in particular or other biotechnological interventions that you think would profoundly disturb that, and not in a short-term way. I mean, I think everyone would agree that if we were to have 200-year lifespans, there would be a period of reckoning, as there is with so many changes that we're currently undergoing that are technological or otherwise, where we come to grips with what this means for those of us who are trying to maximize our human flourishing on whatever theory of human flourishing that we hold, but that in the fullness of time, we might come to some equilibrium with that. Are there certain constraints that you see today that you think ought to be permanent?
Well, do you want to answer first, or want me to answer that one?
You can go ahead.
Well, let me give you an example, because we're back to gene editing, okay? So George and I both know the Chinese scientist He Jiankui, so otherwise known as JK, that's his nickname. He was at a conference that Jennifer Doudna, whose quote was initiated this event. Jennifer Doudna and I are working on a project of deliberation and education regarding the implications of the new tools of gene editing. And George is part of our working group. He came to our first meeting and participated in the second one via video. And the first meeting, JK was there, and we met him, talked to him, heard what he was about. And I'm sure George, just like I, realized he was on the fast track toward germline genetic engineering, although...
I don't remember him at all.
Oh, that's interesting. But in
He
any
did make
case...
an impression.
Yeah, well, he was a young guy. We just
Did he
invited...
give a talk?
Yeah, he did.
Oh, okay.
You had some very good comments in response.
I'm
sorry, that's all
narcoleptic.
right. We're all very busy. That was 2 years ago. But so now JK did this dramatic experiment that was leaked. It wasn't intended to be a public event, but it took place at the Hong Kong summit, and it was like an explosion to the summit. It made worldwide headlines. I was there, and it was really like nobody was talking about anything else. And because the summit was partly designed for the public image of science, I'm not saying that was the only goal, but that was part of the goal, to announce to the world that we know there are serious ethical issues associated with these technologies, and we can handle the regulation of ourselves. We don't want the government and everybody's frightened scenarios to control this science. And JK's experiment basically was a big embarrassment to the Hong Kong summit, and the organizer, the convener, David Baltimore, Nobel laureate from Caltech, stood up and said, this event shows that we have not been able to effectively self-govern our social scientific process. And he assigned it to the lack of transparency, which I think is correct also. Everybody piled on JK with huge criticism, and to his credit, George gave an interview to Science Magazine saying, wait a minute, this is the goal. Even if he's gone a little fast, and you can say what you said, but I was very happy to see what he wrote, because I know JK pretty well, because he came to see me numerous times afterwards at Stanford. And I got to know him and talk with him deeply about what he was doing. And it's not quite fair to say he's this guy after pure fame and fortune and did it in a corner. He did it talking to many people, and he's also has very idealistic goals. He's kind of a touching person, actually, in the sense of what he wanted to see happen. But just to circle back to what I was really going to say was, so his experiment was done. 7 days later, he got an email from an infertility clinic in Dubai saying, hey, we want to take a course from you. We want to learn how to do this. And you know, everybody knows where that's going to lead. It's going to do the same thing that the stem cell issue did. It's going to lead to these kind of edgy clinics all over the world offering services and advertising services. And the reason I bring this up is because this is one thing I don't want to have happen with biotechnology, is for it to become a promoted, aggressive disruption of normal life processes. I do not want procreation to be turned into production. I don't want to see the normalization of IVF for every new baby that comes into the world. I do not want to see the commercialization of reproduction. And these are very great dangers. And when we speak about the possibilities in science, we need to be alert to what is, you might say, in man, in the sense that Jesus himself, it says in the Gospels, Jesus himself had needed no one to bear witness to what is in man's heart. And we know what's in man's heart. There's all sorts of strange and distorted ambitions and appetites and disproportions. We want to be very careful, and powers coming into our hands are greater than we've ever had before to intervene in human life. So there are very serious concerns.
George.
Yeah, I think you don't even have to go to a fertility clinic. They've done polls, and the public, to the extent that they understand it, are about 75% in favor of this kind of technology, both in China and the United States. But put that aside, because maybe they need more time to think about it. Getting back to the issue of whether our current healthy status, our doubling of our average age, is due to biotechnology, I would argue that it is. You've said that it's mainly about eating well and exercising, but I think it's also antibiotics, vaccines, surgery, ambulances, all kinds of things that are very technological, and many of which we do not understand. The average person on the street does not understand how these things work. In fact, they often misunderstand them, misrepresent them. If you say, almost everything in this thing is magic to most people. GPS, how did that fit in there? And it's like, all those satellites inside this thing. We're getting to more and more things which no individual person understands. Even the world's expert, even the world's most multidisciplinary person can't explain most of our technology. And that's not necessarily, I think, something that alters our soul. I mean, I think we still care about each other, and we still care about the planet at some level. That extra technology helps us reduce the fraction of people that are in poverty, not necessarily the absolute number, but the fraction. And we can just the rising tide will float all the boats, and we'll get more resources to make a healthier, hopefully more spiritually aware world. But it's hard to be focused on these higher level concerns when you're spending all your time keeping your family from dying of horrible diseases.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and you may not understand how your cell phone works. I really don't understand how my toaster works. So it's not the not understanding those things. It's what my point was a little abstract, but there are parts of human life that we don't want to treat as though they are just engineering challenges. I mentioned sports, but it goes beyond that. I think the way a human life unfolds is we probe the world by intention. We understand ourselves within the context of that interaction with the world, and we build up a memory recording of how we relate to the larger world, and that's the formation of personal identity or the autobiographical self. And if we are frequently intervening, and I think we're already too frequently intervening in our biology, we disrupt the normal chemistry of identity and personal control of our lives. And it's maybe hard to lay out in clear fashion in such a short forum, but I think it's a very serious concern. When we did the volume that I mentioned in the President's Council, we spent quite a few pages explaining how the relationship between personal process and meaningful life are serious matters to be concerned about in the age of biotechnology. And part of our lives is not just affecting desired ends, but having an understanding of the means toward ends. Education is one of them, character development of certain qualities, moral, spiritual development. I personally don't want to take a pill to become a better Christian. I want to learn through the pedagogy of experience what it means to be a person. And by the way, jumping back to the goals of longevity and so forth, I was at the dentist a while back. We all hate that, but and the hygienist was saying, be sure to floss, because then your teeth will live forever. And I said to her, well, frankly, I don't care if my teeth live forever. I only want them to live as long as I do. And that's the way I feel about my life. I would like my life to unfold for purposes that are higher than just the preservation of my body. I would like to live my life in such a way that the meaning of it is a contribution and an engagement with the larger world. And frankly, I would like to be like Soren Kierkegaard. I would like to use myself up so that I would give myself every last ounce of mental and physical energy in this kind of sacrificial mode of understanding and ascending to and magnifying the presence of love in the world.
I want to go to some audience questions in a minute, but before I do that, I want to end our three-way conversation here on a note on which George may exceed us all as a bioconservative, because I know him to be not just interested in preserving the current natural status quo on the planet, but actually wanting to wind it back to the Ice Age in some corners of it through his involvement in this project I had the pleasure of visiting in Siberia called Pleistocene Park a number of years ago. And part of that would be hopefully to resurrect through gene editing and other fancy biotechnologies the woolly mammoth. And so I was hoping, George, that you could give us an update here tonight. Is there like a woolly mammoth in a tank in a lab somewhere here, a few buildings away.
Well, I mean, some people are opposed to this because they think they had their chance. And I'm not, we're just creating opportunities. But I think it's not so much about bringing back the ancient species. It's about bringing back ancient genes to enrich current species. And neither of those is natural, I'll admit it, except to the extent that we are part of nature, and therefore it is natural. We are engineers by nature. Education is very far from natural, the way we do it now with Gutenberg and everything, all the fancy new stuff that avoids eye contact by looking at books. But with the point of this is to the Asian elephants are endangered species. They're dying partly because of herpes virus and partly because of their strange interaction with humans. They're in highly populated regions. So this would help them, but also they could help us if the Arctic carbon is in danger, which it seems to be. So that's a longer story. But your question is whether we have them coming out of our Brave New World tanks, and the answer is no, not yet. But we have most of the edits we think we need. We've developed new methods we can sequence the ancient DNA. We've brought back a couple of ancient genes, and they're fully functional, and they look like they're exactly what you would expect physiologically to form the transport of oxygen at low temperature, the conductance of nerve sensory inputs at low temperature. So we're bringing back individual genes, and that may be all we do. We just bring back those genes, and that gives elephants ability to live at low temperatures again. They're already hybrids. I mean, they have bits of mammoth DNA in them, just like I have bits of Neanderthal DNA in me. There's a lot of that stuff going on in the past.
Bill, do you have any special objection to the resurrection of extinct species? Particularly, and you talked earlier about sort of living within meaning in the created order. Obviously, these things, it's in dispute as to whether humans in particular caused mammoth extinctions. It seems very likely. But we certainly caused the extinctions of the vast majority of megafauna during the Ice Age and in the millennia afterward. And it might be that living within meaning in the created order is taking acts of restoration along those lines. Would you object to that, or does that come into conflict with your values at all?
Well, I find George's ideas of bringing the woolly mammoth back exciting.
Yeah.
And I think I'm with E.O. Wilson on this. I think it's absolutely a scandal that we're not taking better care of the natural world and the species are going extinct. I mean, where are we as Christians in this very, very important honoring the created order? It gets a little more edgy when George talks about de-extinctioning Neanderthals. I mean, that raises some. You don't talk about that, no.
Not usually.
It's
certainly not working on it.
I mean, it would certainly be fascinating, but it also raises the question of whether it would be fair, whether it would be kind. And I think in the final end, all of our technology ought to be governed within the frame of love and real consideration, both for human and non-human creatures.
Do you have any worries about, I'm just thinking about epigenetics and the idea that we didn't know maybe exposure to some chemicals would affect 3 generations down the line, and that we had no way of knowing until long after the chemicals were widely distributed. So is there any worry that there will be and are likely to be potentially unintended effects of some biotechnologies, and we'll have no way of knowing about them until it's too late? George, do you worry about that?
I do. Like I said, I worry about everything. And I think there are lots of very long-term unintended consequences. For example, a number of authors have documented how agriculture was a bad idea, forced us into cities and all kinds of diseases, and probably our ancestors had a better life in certain senses. But I think very few of us would want to go back even 20 years, much less 20,000. So, we take, it's a matter of net, the risks and harms being outweighed by the benefits. And I think we're pretty good at rejecting things that are either not quite ready or even we go back in time occasionally. Not, for example, we brought the wolves back to Yellowstone. That was something. In fact, most new technologies, I try to urge people to, first thing you should do when you're developing a new technology is figure out how you're going to control it and reverse it. Before you perfect it and make it addictive, how are you going to get it back? I don't think anybody knows how to reverse this. I think it'd be very difficult. But wolves, they reversed in the Galapagos, they reversed the introduction of goats. Invasive species around the world are being reversed. I think that's an important aspect of technology, is to be thoughtful about that.
John Muir once said, when you try to pick out anything by itself, you find that it's hitched to everything else in the universe. And that has a good wisdom and cautionary feeling to it, because we're getting a greater sense through ecology and systems biology of how things are interrelated. In biology, there's very little linear cause. There's networks of causation. Every gene does many things in the body, and every trait we care about is affected by many genes. And it's not going to be easy to alter our species, and we could make some very bad mistakes. But it's very definitely in the scheme of things for us to intervene in nature. I agree with George on that. It's just how we do it is the question. I have a quote that I think is very pertinent here from John Stuart Mill. Galen, the first century Roman physician, said, "The physician is only nature's assistant." But then the question comes up, what does it mean, and how do we intervene in nature to serve as nature's assistant without destroying the good in the natural order? This is a quote from John Stuart Mill, and he says, "Nor can any person, whatever kind of religious phrases he may use, fail to believe that if nature and man are both the works of a being of perfect goodness, that being intended nature as a scheme to be amended, not imitated by man." So it is our mysterious role as human beings to intervene in nature, but also with a great sort of modesty of gratitude, if you will, a humility.
My question is, in light of the uproar over Dr. JK's experiments, I think it's very probable that future germline editing experiments will be done in secret and just not reported. So in light of that, do you think insisting on self-regulation of the scientific community is the best way to actually prevent ethical catastrophes like that, or is there another way forward?
I've been rather outspoken that I think moratorium and self-regulation is posturing. It is not nearly the most reasonable way to proceed. I think that in contrast to having a voluntary moratorium, we need to have involuntary laws, which we actually already have. It's illegal in the United States to practice any kind of medicine that has not been through any kind of pharmaceutical medicine, that has not been through FDA or equivalent clinical trials. So that's involuntary. Having a voluntary thing on top of that is just posturing. But what we can do is surveillance. That is not well represented. I mean, the DAE does some surveillance, but we could add to that is that it's like the TSA says, if you see something, say something. There were quite a few people in the world who knew what JK was doing, and they could have said something. I proposed in 2004 a surveillance system that's computerized that looks at the landscape of purchase orders for things like synthetic DNA, and that is now that was resisted in 2004, but today that 80% of DNA synthesis companies abide by these sorts of rules, and we're trying to get it to 100% very soon. So those are things that we can do that go above and beyond the law of the land right now.
Yeah, that's really important because it's not just people doing kind of imprudent genetic engineering, it's bioterrorism
Right.
issues here.
Yeah.
But with regard to moratorium, JK emailed me soon after the Hong Kong summit and asked if we could talk on the phone. And that began a series of conversations that went on for months and included long 2 and 3 hour conversations. I know basically the whole story of what happened in JK's experiments. And at one point I got into a conversation with him about how he moved in advance so fast. One time when he was at Stanford, I said to him, JK, don't be in a hurry. There's a collective wisdom in the larger community of science and society on these matters. And I even cited for him the Gettysburg Address, that I said, this is the strength of our society, that we govern in an order of the people, by the people, for the people, and that distills the collective wisdom. And after he left, I sent him an email with the Gettysburg Address in it, and I wondered what the Chinese authorities saw as they saw that flow through. But in any case, JK told me that see, what happened was every time something like the Nuffield Council came out of saying it was a good idea to do germline genetic engineering and maybe even enhancement technologies at some point, and there were other things, JK kept thinking of this as checking the boxes off, that we're getting there very ready. And he told me that had there been an actual moratorium proclaimed, he would not have done his experiment. So I sort of agree with George, but on the other hand, what's going to stop these infertility clinics? Maybe you can't stop them. We can't control drugs, prostitution, and a lot of other bad things in the society, but this strikes me as a potentially very pernicious development to have a commercialization of reproduction. So what do you think, George? I mean,
I think the fundamental difference between this and stem cells is this is technology that works. A lot of the stem cells
that may be worse.
It could be worse, but it is a difference. That's one thing. The other thing is I think we've had a great deal of exceptionalism where we focus on engineering germline embryos, and we sort of has false reassurance that we don't need to worry about engineering the somatic cells in the body of adults. I think that that's actually much more dangerous, much more to our society, to our souls, and to everything else, because it happens much faster. There's many more of us. I mean, there's many more adults than there are babies, and we kind of know what we want. And for example, we have a aging population that is very distraught over cognitive decline, and there will be a variety of drugs. Many of them will be, gene therapies and many of them are already in the pipeline that have been announced that prevent cognitive decline. Some of those will also be cognitive enhancement, and if you use them in somebody who isn't going into cognitive decline, then that's exactly what many people are concerned about. But it doesn't require the germline, and it goes so much faster. If you want to do an experiment that involves the germline, it takes you at least 20 years to see how it turned out. And if you're talking about preventing cognitive decline, it takes you 60 years to see how it turned out. Then you got something wrong and you do an adjustment, and another 60 years go by. But with something that acts in adults, 5 weeks later, oh yeah, doing better, twist the knobs a little bit more, and then you could have something that goes exponential.
Yeah,
So I think, but I've heard that all concern of that, almost all of it, drop away because everybody's, gaga about the CRISPR babies who will probably grow up just like the first in vitro fertilization baby and be poster children for how this, quote, works. I think we're getting distracted.
Yeah, I agree with George on that. And to just put an exclamation point behind his comment, it's not just serious somatic diseases like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis that we might reasonably address. These these new tools will give us power to intervene over regulatory sequences in such a way that we can affect the quantity and chronology of gene production. And that means the spectrum of possible interventions is enormous. And the uses of this technology for potential enhancement is vastly greater than people currently realize. That's why I really do believe we're at a very great hinge of history now. The tools that we're developing are going to have a major impact on human life, and it's time we as a society started recognizing that and started addressing the core philosophical, theological, aesthetic, and social issues that this raises.
We've talked a lot about how this research should be regulated and whether or not we should proceed with this this technology. And I was wondering, just if if there is this possibility of extending human life or resurrecting Neanderthals and editing genes and all of this, how does that change? And if these possibilities are actualized or have the potential to be actualized, how does that change your how you think of humans and like what does it mean to be human, and also the human's relationship to God? How, even if we do not proceed with this science, how do these possibilities change how you think about what it means to be human?
You're on, George.
Thanks for giving me the softball. Yeah, so I mean, most of the things you listed, I mean, I don't think there's sufficient motivation to do some of them, like Neanderthal. I just don't think that's going to be a high priority. It's going to be like jetpacks. We're not going to do it because we have a moratorium on jetpacks. It's just because there isn't that much need for them, or want. But I think that if you just take the spirit of your question, if we could change anything and everything about ourselves and our environment, how does that change us? And I think that it depends on what you consider human nature. I mean, we're radically different from. If we brought our ancestors back from 20,000 years ago and plopped them in this room, maybe clothed them, they would not understand wouldn't understand why we're putting clothes on them. We wouldn't understand why we're so obsessed about these little cell phones and talking about colonies on Mars and all this stuff that is our culture and our technology. It's just they wouldn't understand why we care, much less how we do it. So from that standpoint, we are already transhuman. We're so many stages beyond where our ancestors were. But we still care about one another. We still have, if anything, we've had more time to reflect. And it's not a brutish life where we go from crisis to crisis. And hopefully we can enhance that, not necessarily by taking a pill to become better Christians, but by securing less poverty, more time to reflect, because we're healthier. I'm sure that if we put our mind to it, we could make ourselves inhuman and horrible. But I don't think that's the feedback loop that we have right now.
I think that's the core question we need to ask ourselves. What exactly is human nature, and what is the fuller, more flourishing expression of human nature? I think in some senses we still are that same creature. I mean, when they went north, they probably figured out why they wanted to wear clothes. But it's been said that Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist, said that human beings are that species which by nature has no nature. And that's a kind of a hyperbolic overstatement with an existential flavor. But having said that, there is something mysteriously indeterminate about human nature. We don't quite know who we are yet. And I'm excited about the future, actually, and many discoveries of unknown capacities that are within human nature. But I think in order to build on the future, we have to realize what we have gotten from our ancestral past. And to my mind, that is summarized by a term I use in my teaching, that we are a general purpose organism, that our unique place and intelligence and operation and understanding in the world are grounded in the sort of breadth of our generality. This is this is indicated sort of symbolically by our dentition, which is a general purpose dentition. We don't just have the big molars or the big incisors. We have a general dentition. It's indicated by our body form, our upright posture, beholding species. We operate on the world with our hands, what Aristotle called the tool of tools. We're an amazingly versatile creature. We can live in all sorts of environments, think all sorts of thoughts, act in ways over and against and within the world that no other creature can. And if we get drawn in by something like gene editing or any other intervention to specializing ourselves, then we will actually lose something, even if we gain something special for some focused purpose. I think human beings have to recognize who they are in a sort of reverent humility, actually, and realize we are the end product, so far anyway, of a trajectory toward breadth of understanding and breadth of operation in the world, and that comes from our general nature, not a highly specific. I mean, it definitely is built on a highly specific biology, but we don't want to disrupt that and make ourselves extra good at something and then lose something in another quarter of life.
I'd like to know what you think would define the future scenario using this technology to its fullest, all of the range of developments that we've talked about. What would make you willing to define it as progress? And I was just thinking, like, for example, if we have a certain genetic modification that does cause some down the line effects, but let's say we've passed the escape velocity of genetic mutations such that even if it has some bad effects, we can do another modification to mitigate the negativity of that. So you get to do your enhancement, and you just have to fix some of the other side effects that causes, and maybe that shifts healthcare so that you still maybe have the same costs that we have today, just you're spending it on continued modifications. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's just like a way of thinking about how do we know that how would either of you define it as progressing rather than just shifting the issues that face us today?
Well, I agree with Bill that what we need is diversity, and we don't want to lose diversity. We might even want to gain diversity. Right now we can live in the at 15 degrees Kelvin in the vacuum and coldness of space. That's an amazing extension of our diversity. I think that the trend line, as I see it, is we keep expanding human potential. I think one of the things that makes us human, somewhat captured implicitly in Bill's comments, is our ability to think about the far distant past and plan for the far distant future. And we should get better and better at that, because that's what protects us ultimately from extinction. Not just us, but the whole planet. And humans are probably one of the distinguishing features of, we're probably the only species that can save the other species from extinction, whether or not the Earth goes up in flames. I would consider progress or success is our ability to retain those aspects of human nature, no matter how grossly we might change in morphology or exactly how we learn, whether it's word of mouth or by demonstration or by books or by phone. I think what's important is we retain those other aspects of human nature in caring and curing enough diseases so that we can carry on all those other activities.
We have been formed and fashioned throughout the phylogenetic foundations and our species experience in the earth in its natural form. We are the end product of millions of years of field testing, if you will. Our species is packed for all kinds of weather. In other words, we are equipped to deal with things we don't even know exist, different viruses that we don't think of today at all. We better have a little humility about who we are before we go and intervene in a kind of dramatic way driven by our appetites and ambitions. I'm very skeptical of scenarios like are painted currently by Yuval Noah Harari and by other writers about a whole new divergent species. I was watching somebody walk their little terrier of some sort, one of those little tiny dogs across the crosswalk today, and I was thinking, are we going to create human breeds? There are, in a sense, human breeds. Those are different groups of humans we can identify as from different geological areas of the world, geographical areas. But do we really want to breed humans? We're pretty much the same in our raw capacities. Do we want a specialized human breeds? I want to read you a quote from Yuval Harari, and I find it disturbing. He says, our species will upgrade itself into another kind of being within a couple of centuries at most. Earth will be populated by beings who are different from us in their cognitive and physical abilities. Well, I don't know what he really means there, but if he means dramatically different, I disagree. I think we'll pretty much be the same kinds of creatures in 200 years that we are today, because I think in the intervening years we will start to appreciate who we are and what we are and the diversity of possibilities and talents that make us human. And we will probably stumble through and have many tragic episodes as we try to remake ourselves. So there's an old saying, wise saying, that if you really want to understand something, try changing it.
I would just quickly note that if we went 200 years back, we would, or 20,000 years back, our cognitive and physical abilities are incredibly better today than they, and I don't think we want to go back to the way they were, even, that's just my guess.
You think our raw cognitive, I mean, you're not talking
Not
about
raw,
enhanced
no.
tools.
I'm talking about enhanced cognition and enhanced physical capabilities are far beyond 20,000 years ago.
Well, there are
So
writers.
for example, you know, I have access to the whole world's knowledge at the tip of my fingers.
Well, those are the external tools, though. But the
They're
raw
not
material,
external. They're heritable. People consider it part of their body. You know, you can draw a fine line if you want, but the thing is, we have become intimately connected with our culture, and I think that if we were to go back in time, or they were to come forward in time, we would not be comparing our naked self to their naked self. We would be talking about us with all of our apparatus, our jets and our phones. That would be unfair to say that's not part of human nature today.
well,
It is.
it's certainly part of functional human process in
Yeah,
nature.
absolutely.
But I would say that the raw organism, were a person born 200 years ago suddenly have been frozen and brought back to life, I think he'd be capable of operating
Absolutely.
in our world the same way.
But we're not limited to our biology.
Well,
you
that's
know.
true, but there's a difference between us and our tools and our equipment. I was on a panel for a PBS program called Ethics in America, together with Justice Scalia and this well-known bioethicist Art Kaplan. And Art Kaplan was sort of mocking Scalia for saying he wouldn't like his son to use cognitive-enhancing drugs. And Art Kaplan pointed to Scalia's glasses and says, you got your glasses on. How's that different from a drug to change your son's brain? And I circled back to that little comment and I said, there's a very huge difference between one is a tool, the other is actually intervening in the very substrate of organic existence. And I think that is a difference. And I mean, I certainly agree with George that these new powers like cell phones and everything else are seamlessly integrated with our identity, self-concept, and effectiveness of operation. But there's still the same raw body being born into the earth that was born 200 years ago. And I think that's what we have to be very careful not to compromise that core of human nature. We don't want to, I don't like the scenarios of neural dust, which is nanoparticle receptors sprinkled into your brain to send out signals, to integrate inputs, and neural lace threaded into your vessels in your brain.
How is that different from a pacemaker or implanted electrodes to deal with blindness or epilepsy or hearing loss.
I'd be fine with nanoparticles, nanodust, and neural lace if it's treating a pathology, but if it's aimed at better gaming or
So what pathology is this dealing with?
well, it's
That's
not
creating
integrated in your
maybe
body
something.
so far. You want
Well,
that
but-
in your head?
Well, let's say it's on your eyes.
You'll never get away from it.
It's on your eyes. You know, you got glasses, you can take them off. You have contacts, you can take them off. You know, or you have them a little bit further in, you can shut them off, right? So, I mean, I don't think there's that big a wall that you can say that it's inside versus outside anymore. I mean, we
Well,
surgically implant all kinds of things.
That
Anyway.
that may be possible to do. I personally don't want my cell phone to be between my eyes and my brain, but maybe
It's already altered your brain, or
Yeah,
many
I-
people's
I-
brains.
I know, but
And-
theoretically, I
and
can
books
throw it
have
away.
too. Books, yeah, you could,
Yeah.
yeah, but you
But
don't.
I think we should be careful of those kinds of interventions. I don't.
We agree. We should be careful.
Yeah, I mean, as a physician, I'm trained in the tradition that says, above all, do no harm. And I know that everything you do, even taking Tylenol, changes lots of genes, and everything you do to your body alters you, and even your experiences. But there is a natural filter between external impingement and interventions at the very core of your organic substance. That to me is a barrier, and I try as a physician as far as possible to stay away from doctors and their interventions.
So
And
I think
that will include biotechnologists and their interventions. You know, in Silicon Valley, there's this fashion of biofluidity, a kind of willingness to alter your body. There's a whole phenomenon of people microdosing LSD before they go down to work at Apple every day. I think that's very imprudent stuff. I, for one, am maybe a little superstitiously in favor of my own natural body.
So I think that brings us to our time. Thank you guys so much.
Sir.